Good morning, everyone. This is Crystal Collins here at the Tennessee Higher Education Commission. I am joined this morning by Stephen Gentile, and we're very thankful to have you all here this morning as we present the 1520 Outcomes Funding Formula and give a demonstration of how the funding formula, the new funding formula, was used and operated in 1617. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started here. Everyone's going to stay in listen-only mode, whether you are listening through your speakers or through your phone. We're not going to make anyone's microphone live, so you can continue to have conversations if you're in a room with other people. If you have any questions on your screen as part of your webinar, there's a section for questions. Please feel free to type in a question at any time. Either Stephen or I will answer that during our presentation. If we miss you or miss that question at the end, we will go back through and we might contact you through email to answer that question or try and get to it towards the end of the presentation. A couple other things. This webinar is going to be archived, so if you know people on your campuses or in your offices who would be interested in seeing it at a later date, we have it available for others, and we hope to be able to send out a link and an email with that sometime either today or early next week. And we're scheduled to talk for about 90 minutes here, so we encourage you to ask questions. We plan on pausing in our presentations and asking if there are any questions at that time. We know it's going to be a lot of information. 90 minutes is a long time to talk about anything, especially numbers and data. So without further ado, we're going to go ahead and get started here with the PowerPoint presentation, talking about what changed in 1520. You'll notice that we've placed 3 handouts for you to download if you'd like as part of the webinar here, and we'll just go through those really quickly. The first one is the PowerPoint presentation, which I'm about to start right now, which will look at the foundation of the outcomes-based funding formula, the role of the Formula Review Committee that we have had every year that the formula has been in place, but especially the one that was convened last year in 2015, and then also any changes made to the 1520 model. And then we're going to move on to that first Excel document after that. That's the 1617 Outcomes Formula. Stephen's going to use that to give a demonstration of the 1520 formula to show how we get from the new data all the way to a recommendation for each institution. And then if we have time, we're going to talk very quickly about the governor's recommendation for institutions, as we got a governor's budget last week. Okay, so most of you should be very familiar with CCTA, and CCTA is the Complete College Tennessee Act. It was passed in January of 2010, and it was the driving force for developing an outcomes-based funding formula. The legislation called for reforms in several areas: student transfer, so increasing the ability of students to be able to transfer without losing credits, and that's led to our Tennessee transfer pathways. This idea of research collaboration, prompting institutions to work not only with local businesses but with each other to increase research and research dollars in Tennessee, and then also a funding formula policy. And while the funding formula policy, as identified in the Act, was not very proscriptive, other than to say it should be exclusively based on outcomes rather than either beginning or end of term and enrollment, there were a couple things that it did say that we probably should look at: completion, maybe progression of students, make sure that there was something in there about transfer. But other than that, the Act itself left it up to THEC and a Formula Review Committee to develop a formula that focused on outcomes. Now, I know most of you have seen this lovely graphic before. This is what the funding formula looked like in Tennessee pre-2011. So from 79 to 2011, for those 30-some-odd years, we had 95% of our funding based on enrollment, and then about 5.45% based on performance funding. And this performance funding is a long-standing program that's been around since the late 70s, and it looked specifically at basically quality on campuses. So how many of your students were passing, were passing their licensure test? How many of your students were passing any general education core testing? And with the advent of the CCTA and the outcomes-based funding formula, basically what we moved to was all of the enrollment went away, and that enrollment piece was replaced with an outcomes piece. We did decide to keep the performance funding piece. And this performance funding piece, now referred to as quality assurance, is still doing what it was doing since the 70s, and making sure that the education that is being offered at our institutions is of high quality. Now we're going to talk about the Formula Review Committee. So let's talk specifically about the Formula Review Committee that met in 2015. So every year that we've had the outcomes-based funding formula, we have had a Formula Review Committee every summer. And what that Formula Review Committee has done is each year it's looked at the formula and decided if it needed to be changed, if there were things that needed to be addressed. And in the first 5 years of the formula, luckily there wasn't anything that was too terribly striking that needed to be changed or fixed. The formula was operating how it was intended to operate, and it was doing what it should do by moving money based on performance at institutions. We did have a couple definitional changes in that 10 to 15 cycle, and we did have a couple Carnegie classification changes. But outside of that, no big changes with the formula. After that first 5 years, however, it became apparent to THEC and to our stakeholders at the institutions that we should probably think about reopening the formula and looking at it from top to bottom and seeing if we were where we wanted to be and how we could make it better moving into the next 5-year cycle. So in early 2015, a 1520 Formula Review Committee was convened, and members of that included presidents, provosts, chief financial officers, faculty members, state government representatives from here at THEC, and others. That FRC met at least once a month from February to June and proposed and reviewed any changes to the 10-15 model. Also, as part of that process, all presidents and chancellors at every campus were asked to propose and review formula changes of their own, specifically looking at outcomes and weighting structures for those institutions. After the FRC completed their work, we convened a statutory Formula Review Committee, which is actually in statute and required. That review committee was convened in late June, and then the changes that were proposed by the FRC, the summer FRC, the statutory FRC, were presented to the THEC Commission and approved in July of 2015. Okay, so now we're going to go over the changes made to the formula from 1015 to 1520. And so we're going to look at both community colleges and universities, and we're going to talk about everything from minor changes like outcome definitional changes to more robust changes like some underlying structural changes that were made to the formula. So looking specifically here at community college outcomes. So as I said, we queried presidents at all of the community colleges as well as system officials at TBR and other members of the Formula Review Committee and asked them what we should be measuring, what outcomes should be included in the formula for community colleges. And the good news is what we heard was we were measuring what we should have been measuring because we didn't have a lot of new outcomes to be recommended, and we didn't have a lot of outcomes from the 1015 model that were identified for removal. The grouping of outcomes on the left there are the outcomes that were in the 1015 model. The grouping of outcomes on the right are the ones that are included in the 1520 model. If you see a bolded italicized, that means that that outcome underwent an operational change, a definition change. And if you see a strike through, it means that that outcome was removed. And we'll talk more specifically about what that meant and why in a couple of slides. Now here, looking at the outcome changes for universities, again, on the left are the outcomes that were included in the 1015 model. On the right, the outcomes that were included, that are included in the 1520 model. Again, bold, italicized are definitional changes. Strike-throughs are removals. So let's talk about the outcome changes at the at the community colleges really quickly. So a definitional change in short-term certificates. Many of you might be aware that during the 1015 model, we had some significant increases in short-term certificates that were being awarded at campuses, and this idea of stackable certificates where you would award a certificate to a student to show progress, but that certificate on its own was not necessarily a workforce or technical certificate that indicated ability to do something in a job. And so what we've done with the new model, with the 1520 model, is we're moving towards counting all technical certificates. So I believe these are certificates that are identified in the API and through the SIS as C1 certificates. We are not including academic certificates, and academic certificates are stackable certificates that stack towards like a general education core certificate, a long-term 41-hour gen ed core certificate. Another definitional change, awards per 100 FTE. In the previous model, this measure included all undergraduate students, whether you were degree-seeking or not. Now in the new model, we are only including degree-seeking undergraduate students in the FTE count, and we believe that this is going to better measure the efficiency institutions have in producing awards per student. And lastly, remedial and developmental success. This outcome has been removed at the community college level, not because we believe or that the commission or the FRC believed that this was not an important role for community college. It's still a very important role that the community colleges play, but just the method that we had to measure it was getting very muddied. With the advent of integrated learning support on campuses, it was becoming more difficult for us to measure it the way that it was identified in 1015. And so we've removed it as an outcome and instead have replaced it with as a new focus population of academically underprepared, which I'll talk about more specifically in a couple of slides. Now, outcome changes at universities. Again, definitional changes for the progression metrics. The progression metrics used to award credit at 24, 48, and 72 hours. We've now changed those progression metrics for universities to 30, 60, 90. And this is to encourage and focus on on-time completion. In order for a student to finish a 4-year undergraduate degree in 4 years, they need to be taking 30 hours, not 24. So that's 15 hours a semester. So we're focusing on on-time completion at the universities. Again, definitional change for the degrees per 100 FTE, focusing only on degree-seeking undergraduate students and excluding those who are there not seeking a degree. And then lastly, the removal of the transfers out with 12 semester hours. Now, this was not something that was on mine or Stephen's or Dr. Deaton's radar screen when we first started thinking about changes to the formula, but was a suggestion that came out of the formula review process that came out of the FRC committee. And basically what officials on the committee said was that universities are not in the business of transferring out students. They shouldn't be anyway. They're in the business of accepting transfer students from community colleges to complete upper level baccalaureate education, but they're not really in the business of transferring out students. So they requested that that measure be removed. Okay, before we go on and talk about subpopulations, are there any questions at this point? I know a lot of this you guys have already seen before, but we just wanted to make sure everybody knew where we were starting before we got into the demonstration. Okay, if not, I'm going to go ahead and talk about the subpopulation changes. First of all, we're not calling them subpopulations anymore. They're now called focus populations. And the reason for that is because they are populations of focus in the formula and the types of students that we need to focus on in order to get to Drive to 55 to help them complete. Again, as with the outcomes, you'll notice the 10-15 subpopulations are on the left, the 15-20 subpopulations are on the right. What we heard from committee members, as well as from presidents and chancellors and others, is that we absolutely should be focusing on adults and low-income students. That shouldn't change. We also had a couple suggestions, but not really a consensus, around other possible subpopulations. And Stephen will probably talk about this later, but one of the virtues of the new model is it is engineered in such a way that we don't have to wait another 5 years necessarily if a subpopulation or an outcome pops up that needs to be added, because it's already calibrated. So we can add something. So if say STEM degrees became very important and we wanted to provide a subpopulation premium for that, we would be able to offer it. You'll notice that academically underprepared is listed under 15-20. It is only being included at community colleges at this time. There's a working group that is about to that will meet sometime in the next few months to discuss whether or not we should look at academically underprepared for universities. We have a feeling this is going to be a topic of conversation at the Formula Review Committee that convenes this summer. Now, the other thing that we heard was that 40% for the subpopulation premium was simply not enough. And just as a brief reminder, the 40% subpopulation premium means that if you were an adult student who completed a bachelor's degree at a university, rather than that bachelor's degree being worth 1, that bachelor's degree was worth 1.4. If you were an adult low-income student, that bachelor's degree was worth 1.8. And so we were hearing that 40% was simply not enough to reward institutions for the extra effort and focus they were making on those students. So again, we have changed the terminology from subpopulation to focus population. And the academically underprepared, again, as a replacement for the remedial and developmental success. This is going to include students who are identified still as R&D. So any student who is identified through the student information system as requiring remedial or developmental work as identified by the institution are in this metric. We're also including students who score an 18 or below on the composite, math, or reading subscore of the ACT, or students who score a 17 or below on the writing subscore of the ACT. And these are the cutoffs as identified by TBR, by the Board of Regents, for needing developmental work for their students at their institutions. If we were to move this into the university sector, we would need to revisit this and see if that's an accurate measure for universities as well. The other change to subpopulations is this idea of the premiums being elevated and graduated. And what that means is, instead of 40% for a premium, if you trigger 1, let's say you're an adult student and you get a degree, that's now worth 1.8. That's an 80% premium. If you're an adult low-income student, so you trigger 2 subpopulation premiums, that's now worth 2 degrees, or 100% for 2 focus populations. And if you're a student who hits all 3 at a community college, so you're an adult low-income student who was academically underprepared when they entered, then your degree now counts 2.2 or 120%. So elevated and graduated within the formula. And this has changed a little bit the way that that information is presented in the formula, which Stephen will talk about when he does the demonstration, because we are looking at 1, 2, and 3 subpopulations rather than adult subpopulations strictly or low-income subpopulations strictly. So that does change some of the way that it is presented in the formula. Going forward with this measure, with the academically underprepared measure, again, with the formula being perfectly calibrated, we'll be able to identify and include any definitional changes without having to change the formula or recalibrate. So, for instance, a question, will compass scores be considered as well as ACT scores? If the Board of Regents identifies that as a way of identifying students for R&D or needing remedial work, and the Formula Review Committee agrees to it, we can add it to the model very easily. So the answer to that is sure, if the parties involved would like to include it. Mission weights. So Most of the things that we heard over the first 5 years of the formula was that institutions wanted to revisit their mission weights, their weighting structures, because their mission in 2011 was probably not the same as their mission in 2015. Institutions grow and they change. Luckily, with the new model, with the 1520 model, we are able to develop weights that reflect institutional mission and reflect priorities of the presidents and chancellors of those campuses without being hamstrung into the calibration zone, having to use them to calibrate the model. So with the 1520 model, we surveyed all of our presidents and chancellors. We asked them to prioritize all of their outcomes, and then we assigned weights to those prioritized outcomes in order to reflect the mission that they identified for their institutions. Now, during this process, with the Formula Review Committee, members of the Tennessee Board of Regents came to the FRC and suggested that maybe the community college sector should actually act as a sector and a system and use a consistent weighting structure with a focus on completion outcomes to reflect the needs of the state. And what this means is basically every community college has the same weight on associate degrees, the same weight on certificates, and the same weight on progression metrics. Where the mission differentiation comes in for community colleges is when looking at dual enrollment, job placements, transfers, and workforce training. And what this allows institutions, community colleges, to do is to identify themselves as an institution who is creating certificate holders, degree holders, who go straight out into the workforce and get a job, if that's their main focus, or a community college that is producing students who get an associate's degree and transfer out to a university in order to complete their baccalaureate education, or if they're a little bit of both. And examples of that look like this. These are the community college weights that are included in the 1520 model right now, and you'll notice, again, all of the progression metrics are the same for all of our community colleges. Associate degrees are with 22.5% for all of our community colleges, and then our certificates and awards per 100 FTE are also the same. The difference within the certificates, why you have 17.5 and 2.5 or 10 and 10, this is a reflection of institutional mission as identified by community college presidents during the priority ranking process. So if they ranked 1 to 2 year certificates higher than less than 1 year certificates, we tried to accommodate that by placing a higher weight on those certificates out of that 20% when we were splitting them. Now you'll see, for instance, at Cleveland State is identifying itself, it appears to us anyway, through its priorities, as a workforce institution, an institution creating individuals who are going out and getting jobs. And that's why they've put 25% of their weight on job placement and workforce training, and only 5% on transfers out. Compare this to Dyersburg, who placed 25% on dual enrollment and transfer. So they're probably servicing students who are moving on to universities, or high school students who are going to come to them to complete a degree before moving on to a university. Or we have an institution like Motlow that has a little bit of both, where you can see there's an even distribution between job placement, dual enrollment, transfer, workforce training. These are the university weights for the 1520 model that were used to make this, the FY17 appropriation recommendation. Again, we're trying to show complexity. Institutions here are grouped together by Carnegie classification, and they become more complex moving from left to right across the screen. So Martin, being a master's large institution, is on the far left, and then UT Knoxville being a research very high institution on the far right. And you'll notice that the mission of the institution becomes more complex as you move from left to right. What we found through this process, through the formula review process, though, is that some institutions were deviating from what we would think would be their institutional priorities or their institutional outcomes of focus based on their Carnegie classification. Take Martin, for example. While they do have a high weight on bachelor's and associate degrees, 30%, which it makes sense for a master's large institution, they also put the highest weight of any of the institutions on 6-year graduation rate. And Martin is making a very concerted effort to increase their graduation rate and to complete their students on time. And so it'll be very interesting to see how that weighting structure plays out as we move through the 15-20 funding cycles. Again, you'll notice, especially with the bachelor's degrees, that's the best example of how we're still modeling along institutional mission and Carnegie classification, moving from 30% at Martin to 20% at UT Knoxville. Any questions about the weights before we move on to structural changes? Okay, out-of-state tuition deduction. Now, many of you are very aware of this process and how it was included. It was included in the model before 1015, and it was included in the 2010-15 model. And basically, what happened was a portion of each institution's formula calculation was deducted based on how many out-of-state students they enrolled. And so we would determine the average state support per FTE, then multiply that number times the number of out-of-state FTE for tuition-paying purposes, and then subtract that value from your overall formula recommendation. There was a lot of concern about this process. It really hamstrung our institutions to reach out and find out-of-state students that they needed in order to meet both institutional and state needs, not just the drive to 55, but the ability of institutions to continue to fund operations with decreasing state appropriations. And what we've found and what institutions have told us is that students, out-of-state students, especially border state students who move to Tennessee to go to college here, are more likely to stay after they complete their degree and contribute to the Tennessee economy. And so the argument was, why are we penalizing institutions for this when these students are contributing to the drive to 55? And so as part of the 1520 model, we were able to remove this deduction for out-of-state enrollment from the model. And so that we hope that this is going to free up institutions to be able to move more quickly to the drive to 55. Another structural change is this idea of the salary monetization removal. In the 1015 model, the Southern Regional Education Board average faculty salary was utilized in order to monetize weighted outcomes. And basically what that means is we would take your outcomes, we would weight them and scale them, and then we would monetize them using whatever the average faculty salary was for your peer institutions in the SREB states, so the other 15 Southern Region states. The Formula Review Committee pointed out that this was probably an unnecessary outside influence on the model, because what we would see is, let's say that Texas decided to stop paying their faculty members or reduce the overall faculty salary for all of their faculty. That would artificially deflate the average faculty salary for any of our institutions that had Texas institutions included as their peers, and could potentially allow money to move to other institutions for something other than performance. And so it was identified by members of the FRC that this was probably something that needed to go away. And so we've removed it in the 1520 model and just stop at the weighted outcomes rather than monetizing. And Stephen's going to talk more specifically about that when he gives you a demonstration of the model. Lastly, this idea of calibrated scales. So along with the weights, the scales were used in order to calibrate the model in 1015. And what scaling does is it takes outcomes of different sizes and allows them to be compared to each other. So think about an institution that produces 15 doctoral degrees but also has $20 million in research, or a community college that has 150 long-term certificates but also does 200,000 hours of contact hours or workforce training. We don't want the research or workforce training to over-influence the model over the doctoral degrees or the certificates, right? So we use scales in order to make them comparable, to put them on an even playing field. The scales that were included in 1015 were more arts and science. I mean, anyone that you talk to about that model will say that. They were used in order to calibrate the model to try and get us to start in 1112 where we left off in 1011. Due to the underlying structural changes in the 1520 model, It's perfectly calibrated, and so we didn't have to use the scales to try and calibrate 1520 to where 1015 left off. And so that freed them up, and now they're more mathematically derived. Okay, we're going to move on now to the formula demonstration. Any last questions here on the intro section before we move into the formula? The goal here at this point is to go through the formula step by step, which Stephen's going to do, and if we have time at the end, we're going to revisit this PowerPoint presentation and talk specifically about the governor's recommendation and maybe some formula analysis for 1617. And with that, yeah. Stephen?
All right. Thank you, Crystal. While Crystal was presenting, she actually does not know this, but it became apparent that the handouts were not seen on your end. So I have since emailed all of you that had their emails registered the 3 copies of the attachments. If you did not get that, please email me at Stephen, that's with a V, .gentile@tn.gov. And those attachments are merely meant for your future use. They are just copies of what we are presenting to you today. All right, so the formula demonstration. I'm going to go ahead and apologize in advance because this is something that Crystal and I are very passionate about. We spent a lot of time on this formula last year, putting it together with input from all the stakeholders. And right now we're going to go into the nitty-gritty details on how this formula works. If at some point, if you guys are in a room together and you are on mute and you say, this guy is really crazy with all his number details, that's fine, I understand. But there are some of you guys who've asked these questions, so we are going to go into those details. If you have any questions, we will answer as we go along. After I get to the end of a tab, I will ask for more questions. So to start off here, we're basically going to understand how success in the outcomes formula transforms to our appropriation recommendation. Starting off in this first tab of this attachment, this is our formula. And this right here specifically is our recommendation sheet. If you look at 2015-16, this is last year's recommendation amount numbers, you see how much money in appropriations we distributed as a government. And in total, we gave out $814 million to our community colleges and universities. And Austin P, for instance, got $37 million in total of that $814 million. Now the key to this whole formula is this share right here, appropriation share. So looking at Austin P, that $37 million represents 4.54% of total appropriations. What we want to figure out is how to get that 4.54 to change based on outcomes in the outcomes formula. And this is what happened in this year, 2016-17, the fiscal year for which we made our recommendation that the governor's budget was just set upon. Appropriation share for Austin P increased to 4.65%. So this demonstration is going to go from 4.54 to 4.65 and tell you how we got there. It'll show you how Chattanooga went from 3.37% to actually 3.37%. Although you can see if you go into the finer decimal points, those are different shares. A little housekeeping here. You'll find here a tabs flowchart that is color-coded based on the tabs. And this is how we're going to walk through this presentation this morning. We're going to start off with background data, community colleges, universities, move on through to calculating the weighted outcomes, to our point calculation, and finally to that last tab, the recommendation sheet, which is going to look like this. I will keep coming back to this flowchart to show you where we are in our presentation. Enlarge the spreadsheet. Yes, someone asked if I can enlarge the spreadsheet. I can. I hope this is good for you guys. If not, let me know. And all right, so we're going to walk through this presentation, and you will see text boxes 1, 2, and 3 here. Community college page 3, 4, 5. We're going to end on a recommendation page at step 12 today. And one other note, when I talk about community colleges, due to alphabetical order, I will be referring to Chattanooga State. When I talk about universities, I will be referring to Austin Peay. In the back pages of our formula, we are in order by institutional complexity as determined by the Carnegie classification system. We'll end in alphabetical order, so that's why I'm focusing on Austin Peay this morning. So the first step in our formula is actually tabulating our raw outcomes. Crystal went over in detail what those outcomes are in our 2015-2020 formula. Some of them changed, most of them stayed the same. But what we started to do back in July is work with the systems, work with Dennis Hinksler at UT, work with Chris Tingle at TBR, and many other people at the institutions to figure out what the exact outcomes are. And we gather for the last 3 years, because you do use a 3-year average in the formula. So for instance, Chattanooga State in 2014-15, academic year 2014-15, had 2,159 people cross the 12 progression metric benchmark. This focused population overlap, Crystal went into detail about what this means. This is replacing the subpopulations that we had in the 2010-15 model. This is the data that shows of this 2,159 students who got 12 credit hours in 14-15, 709 of them qualified for one focused population only. So they were either an adult, low income, or academically underprepared. 610 qualified for 2 focused population overlaps, and 252 qualified as all 3 focused populations. There are 252 adults who are low income and also academically underprepared who crossed the 12 credit hour benchmark. To the right in gray are for reference sections, so you can actually see how many adults, low income, and academically underprepared students qualified for those outcomes. And then further to the right are full-time enrollment numbers that we use to calculate awards per FTE. These in themselves are not outcomes, but they help us figure out what the outcomes are. So after we tabulate all the outcomes data, we do work with the systems to verify that and validate that these are the correct numbers. And that's a good process to go through and very helpful for us because we want to have the correct numbers. Step 2 is we combine the general outcomes with the focus populations with the premiums applied. Sorry, I'm getting off page here. To have our combined outcomes. So to walk through this step here, if you click on 2014-15 12 credit hours, I'll go into the cell here. You'll see color-coded for the cells that are actually used in this calculation. We add 2,159 students who qualified for that outcome. To that, we add 709 who qualified for one focused population overlap, multiply that by 80% premium. We then add 610 students who qualify for 2 focused population overlaps, and we multiply that by the 100% premium. And then finally, those who qualified for all 3, 252, we multiply that by 120%, and we add that to the general count. Because again, focused populations premiums are elevated and graduated. We do that for every single outcome here. There are some outcomes for which there are no focused populations. For instance, job placements. There's no looking at premiums for who actually receive those job placements. So it's just a direct entry from over here. I'm going to pause for any questions. While I do that, I'll show you briefly what we do at the universities. Looking at Austin Peay, going to step number 1, I'll enlarge this a bit. Here are the general outcomes for Austin Peay. Very similar to the 2010-15 outcomes. Here are the focus population overlaps. And a reminder, in universities, we do not have academically underprepared as a focus population. So there are only 2 opportunities here. So again, of students who have 30 credit hours, 718 qualified as either an adult or low income, 130 qualified as both adult and low income. Off the page here, you can see how many adult and how many low income, and then full-time enrollment that is used to calculate our awards per 100 FTE. To the left over here, we combine the general outcomes with the premium applied focus populations. Looking at this formula here, AD18 is at 1,495, 30 credit hours, students who qualified in 14-15. To that we add 718 multiplied by an 80% premium over here. And then finally 130 multiplied by the 100% premium for 2 focus populations. And we do that on down for each outcome and for each academic year. At this moment, I see no questions. If you have them, please send them on. We're now going to go from the background data page to the calculated weighted outcomes, the blue tabs here. And again, we'll focus on community colleges first. The very first thing we do here is we actually multiply a 3-year average based on those 3 years of academic year data that we have. Again, the formula uses 3-year average of outcomes. So here we see 3,984 for students accumulating 12 credit hours. So 3,984, if you go back to our CC data page, just over here, take the average of these 3 years of academic year data for accumulating 12 credit hours, and you can look down here at the bottom, the average is 3,984. That matches what we have on that first page. For 24 credit hours, the average here is 3,104. Go back to this tab, you see 3,104. So we take the 3-year average of each and every outcome. The next step, we need to be able to compare the magnitudes of these outcomes. You can see here at Chattanooga, we have nearly 130,000 workforce training contact hours. As a very different magnitude from awards per 100 FTE, for instance, 21. So how can we compare numbers in a couple of dozen to the hundreds of thousands? Well, we scale the data. So step 4 is using that scaled data, using the scales, which are over here to the left. And we're going to divide the 3-year averaged outcomes by the scale. So go into the cell here, you see C6, 3,984, divided by a 6.1 scale. And the same is done for each and every outcome. Crystal went into some detail to say that the scales in our new model are mathematically derived, or to say it better, we use mathematics to get our new scales. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how we get those scales, but in the very last tab of this sheet, we do have a tab dedicated to how we got the scales that we have in our new model. And I also want to show you back to our first tab here. I'm sorry, I'm going all over the place right now. CC data. I'm going to unhide some columns that I had hidden to begin with. And then right here, you'll see if you go to that last tab, some formulas that will bring you back to the CC data tab. To get to the mathematically derived scales that we have, we took the standard deviation of the whole history of outcomes using our new outcomes and new outcome definitions. We wanted to see how have those magnitudes changed over the years. And we use the standard deviation to do that. And I'm not going to go too much into detail on what standard deviations are, but that is basically how we get to the scales that we have now. If you have any questions about scales, please just feel free to email me. We can get into a long discussion about statistics. I will not bore the rest of you with that right now. The next step is we weight those outcomes based on institutional and system priorities for community colleges. We apply these weights right here, and they differ by institution for most of our outcomes. We apply these weights to the scaled outcomes. So we're going to multiply for 12 credit hours 653 times 3%. We get 19.6 in weighted outcome for 12 credit hours. We do the same all the way down to awards per 100 FTE. We multiply the 411 scaled outcome by 5% at Chattanooga. We get 20.5. And then we add all of these together to get our total weighted outcome for Chattanooga, 831. That's the sum. Please feel free to send in their questions about this. I'm going to show you what we do for universities as well. Very similar. Exactly the same thing, actually. At Austin P, we took the 3-year average of 30 credit hours, going back to our university tab. So we see here 2,201. Take the average here. This is 2,201 down here. We do that for each and every outcome. We scale based on the scales we use for universities. We divide 2,201 by 2.50. We get 880. We do this for each and every outcome. We then weight, and the weights again here for universities are done by institutional priorities and informed by Carnegie class. Multiply 30 credit hours, outcome for 30 credit hours, which is 880, times 3%, we get 26.4. We do this on down. Add up total outcomes, weighted outcomes at Austin P is equal to 1,894. I'm going to pause for just a couple of seconds to give you any opportunity to send in your questions if you have any. Right now I'm seeing none. So keep this number in your mind, 1,894, 831 at Chattanooga. Going back to our tab's flowchart, we have now just calculated the weighted outcomes. We're going to move on to point calculation. This is orange tab here. So the same two numbers that we just talked about. At Austin P in 2016-17, their weighted outcomes, as I've said before, is 1,894. At Chattanooga, it's 831. Now I want you to change your thinking. Stop thinking of these as weighted outcomes and think about these as points. And the reason why we're now calling them something different is because there are other components of the formula that have always been in the formula that we now need to convert to similar units so that we can compare them to the weighted outcomes. So fixed costs and quality assurance, we now need to think about these as points. So fixed cost, step number 7. If you're unaware about how fixed costs are calculated, these are based off of what we get from systems and institutions, which are utility costs, maintenance and operation of buildings that are dedicated to the core functions of institutions, so education, administration at our institutions. We have not changed at all how fixed costs are calculated. These have remained the same from the 2010-15 model. However, we are no longer monetizing outcomes, so we therefore need to make sure to get these monetized fixed costs into points. So if you look at fixed costs here in this column, total fixed costs in 16-17 adds up to $424 million. How do fixed costs compare to weighted outcomes? Well, in the past, we actually have historical data here. This is from our last 2010-15 formula. Our total fixed cost number, we have the ability to compare that to what in the past we have used as monetized outcomes. So those weighted outcomes we've been talking about this whole time. As Crystal said, in the prior model, we applied faculty salaries to those weighted outcomes to monetize them. And over those last 5 years, the ratio between fixed cost and monetized outcomes has been very similar. So in 2011-12, it was 22.1, 12-13, 22, all the way up to 15-16 last year, 22.2. So what we've done is actually taken the average of those 5 years and are saying, on average, fixed cost to monetized outcomes is about 21.8%. And we're calling this a constant. So it's actually a much larger, much more complex number than 21.8%. It goes to many different decimal places. But we're calling this our fixed cost constant. And so what does this mean? This means that of our weighted outcomes, we're going to set aside an additional pool of fixed costs equal to 21.8%. So 2016-17, our total weighted outcomes for community colleges, 33,196. You see that number here. We're going to multiply this by our fixed cost constant, 21.8%. And we get 7,246. So in the 16-17 model, we are saying 7,246 points are dedicated to fixed costs. If this fixed cost constant was 100%, you'd see that we have an equal amount of weighted outcome points as we do fixed cost points. But we don't have that as our fixed cost constant. It's 21.8%. And so of this total pool of fixed costs, we are going to divvy up this pool based on the total share of fixed costs that each institution has. So going back to Austin Peay, $16.4 million in fixed costs of the total pool of fixed costs of $424 million. That represents a 3.87% share. Multiply 7,246 by 3.87, you get 280. That is their share of fixed costs. At Chattanooga, this $9.8 million represents 2.32%. They therefore receive 2.32% of the total fixed cost pool. We now add fixed cost points to weighted outcome points, and we get a point subtotal of 2,174 at Austin Peay and 999 at Chattanooga. The next step is to look at quality assurance. And as Crystal, I believe, went over, quality assurance is a new name for performance funding, which has long been a part of Tennessee appropriation distribution. And specifically, we have always given out 5.45% of our total formula is dedicated to quality assurance. Institutions can receive a score anywhere between 0 and 100% on a quality assurance score. It's based on licensure, exam rates, job placements, student surveys, alumni surveys, and this is all done by our academic affairs department. It's not done by Crystal nor I. And let's look at Austin Peay. In 2016-17, Austin Peay received a score of 90. They therefore have an opportunity to receive up to 5.45% in additional quality assurance points based on this score. And here they receive 107 points. I'm going to unhide a column here and show you an example. This is 90. It's a good score. It's not a perfect score. So with that 90 score, they received an additional 107 points, which is actually 4.91% additional. Again, they had an opportunity to get 5.45%. We go into here. 107 divided by 2,174 is 4.91. Had Austin Peay received a perfect score of 100, they would have gotten a 118, and they would have received the full 5.45% in quality assurance points. Chattanooga actually did have a perfect score of 100, which is rare, and they did receive a total of 54 points, which is 5.45% more. We add quality assurance points to the point subtotal, and we get 2,280 for Austin Peay. We get 1,053 for Chattanooga, so 999 plus 554 equals 1,053. And this is the 2016-17 point total. The key, again, to this formula, to our whole outcomes formula, is changing that appropriation share that I showed you in that first tab. How did we get to change Austin Peay from 4.54% to 4.65%? That comes down to the growth in this point total from 15-16 to 16-17. I'm going to make this a little bit smaller so you can see the whole page for just 1 second. Unhide this column here. This is the 2015-16 point total for Austin Peay. And if you compare the growth from 15-16 to 16-17, that's a 2.02% growth in points from 1 year to the next. Now this number here, 2,235. When we made this new formula, we took all the data down of the last 10 years based on new outcomes and new outcome definitions. So by doing that, we recalculated weighted outcome totals based on, this is 15-16, based on new outcomes, new outcome definitions, new scales, new weights, and we calculated new points for 15-16 based on all new information. This allows us, if you think about universities, progression metrics change from 24, 48, 72 to 30, 60, 90. If we had recalculated 15-16 points using old data, you would have seen steep drops in those two sets of progression metrics. From, again, 24 credit hours to 30 credit hours, there are more students passing that 24 credit hour metric than there are 30 credit hour metric. So we did not want to assess outcome success based on old outcomes. We want to compare apples to apples, see how Austin Peay grew in 30 credit hours in 15-16 to 16-17. So again, we went back, recalculated old data, and recalculated new weighted outcomes and new points, which allows us to see how exactly did Austin Peay succeed from 15-16 to 16-17, and they increased 2.02%. I'm going to pause for a minute, let you guys ask some questions, because I know that this is adding some complex layers to the formula. If you guys have any questions, please send them in. If I've lost you, my apologies. I really am, I am sorry. Hope I did not. Okay, right now I'm not seeing any questions, but if they come in, I'll certainly take them. I also want to point out Chattanooga. Chattanooga went from 1,056 in 15-16 to 1,053, which is a negative 0.22% decline in point total. Now, how do we change that appropriation share from where we started? Going back to our flow chart here, we go from point calculation to our final recommendation piece here, 2016-17 recommendation. Yeah. Actually, I got a question about how the quality assurance number is derived. I assume the question is about quality assurance, how that actual number, whether it's 90% or 100%, is derived. That is, again, done through our Academic Affairs Department. And we will send out an email how those numbers are actually calculated. That is written down. I won't go into details here because first of all, I don't want to mess those details up. But Victoria Harpool and Betty Dandridge-Johnson in our office have better write-ups for you that they can compare. Crystal?
Yeah, I'd also point out if you're interested in how quality assurance, the actual number is determined, the 90% or the 100% or the 95%, that can be found on our website. There's an entire section on quality assurance at tn.gov/THEC. It would be under our Academic Affairs Division, and you can find a whole bevy of information about what is included in quality assurance there, as well as historical reports of quality assurance values, and then also the contact information for both Victoria and Betty is on our website.
Thank you, Crystal. We can send you that link after this presentation. Okay, looking again at our final pages here. So we go from point calculation to our final recommendation. How do we change appropriation shares for our institutions? It comes down to these numbers right here in the percent change. So looking at our 1617 recommendation tab, I went through how we calculated the appropriation shares. So again, in 1516, we gave out $814 million in appropriations, $37 million for Austin P, which is 4.54%. I'm going to unhide a column right here. We want to use our change in points, the point percent change from that prior tab, and use those numbers to manipulate appropriation shares. So looking at this column, and item box number 10, and let me make this bigger. Item box number 10. We're going to multiply the 4.54% at Austin P by that point total growth. If I go back to point calculation, 2.02% at Austin P, which is, by the way, cell L11. I multiply 4.5% by the growth in L11, so 2.02%. I add that to the share. That brings the appropriation share growth up to 4.64%. Do the same for Chattanooga. Multiply 3.37 by that point growth, which again is negative 0.22%. That brings their share growth down to 3.36%. If you look at the totals for this column, you see that it all adds up to 99.77%. When we talk about success and the 1617 outcomes formula, you'll hear us say that we experience flat growth, and that's because coming off of the recession, some enrollments have been down at institutions. We expected some outcomes to go down because of that, and they have. And largely it's been a flat growth, but if you look again at point calculation, overall point totals did go down 0.19%. So this column here, when we apply that growth to last year's share, sums up to 99.77%. We, however, want to give out 100% of the appropriations that we have. So in step number 11, we make it so that the appropriation shares add up to 100%. So here we divide 4.64% at Austin P into that total of 99.77%, and we get Austin P's 2016-17 appropriation share. For Chattanooga, we divide 3.36% into 99.77%, and we get 3.37% as Chattanooga's new appropriation share. If you add all these up, you'll see that we get, indeed, 100%. This is mathematically necessary. It can be confusing, which is why I like to hide it from view to show what the appropriation shares change is, but it was necessary. So here we are at the end, which is figuring out that Austin Peay, due to their outcome success, went from 4.54% to 4.65%. Chattanooga stayed pretty much the same. Other institutions, some went down, others went up. Now that we're going into 16-17, we'll have new money to distribute. As a reminder, we went from in 15-16, we had a pool of $814 million. In this year's governor's proposed budget, what came out last Tuesday, the governor proposed an increase of $46 million for community colleges and universities. You may have heard a number of 50 million thrown out there. That 50 million includes $4 million for TCATs, an increase of $4 million for our TCAT institutions. But for universities and community colleges, it's 46 million. We add 46 million to the 813 million from last year. We get a new appropriation amount of $860 million. We divvy up this number based on the 16-17 appropriation shares. So going back to Austin Peay. Austin Peay had 4.65% of a new share. That equals out to about $40 million of this $860 million total. Chattanooga has 3.37% of a new appropriation share. That equates to $29 million of the 860 total pool. For demonstration purposes, if the governor actually proposed a flat budget, in which to mean he said, I'm not going to give any more money to higher ed this year. Thankfully, that is not the case. Let's pretend he recommended an increase of $0. In 16-17, the total appropriation request remains at $814 million. Had this been the case, with Austin Peay's new share, which increased from 4.54% to 4.65%, they now garner more percent of that same funding. So they go from $37 million to nearly $38 million. If I unhide several more columns, you see how the money changes in a no new money situation due to outcome success. Interestingly enough, I told you Chattanooga remained rather flat, and they do. In a no new money situation, they would have gotten $900 more. Thankfully, the governor has proposed more than that. And we see that under the new budget, everyone is actually receiving more money because the governor has proposed more money. Okay, that is the new formula and how it works and how we get to where we are right now. I'm going to pause again for more time. If you have any questions, please send them on in. I'll give you a minute or so. While you're sending in those questions, I'll say that we are working on the new dynamics model. And the dynamic model, if you're familiar with the old formula, was a model that we distributed that allows institutions to plug in new numbers for outcomes to see how their appropriations would change. So you can use a little toggle to increase certain outcomes by 10%, for instance. How will that affect your appropriations? We're going to finalize that once the budget gets through the General Assembly. We'll then send that out. We'll have that on our website, and I will make a note to send that to all of you guys who attended this presentation as well. All right, I am seeing no questions coming in, which I'm going to pretend is a good sign. I'm going to hand this over to Crystal. Crystal?
Okay, so we have about 20 minutes left and probably about 6 minutes more of PowerPoint presentation. So if you think of anything in the interim and want to ask, please feel free. One of the things that Stephen emailed to you that was supposed to go out as a handout through the webinar is a breakdown of the THEC rec using the governor's recommendation. So basically this last bit that Stephen did over here on the right, where he showed the growth and change for each institution. We've sent that to you in an Excel file so that you can look at that, look at your institution, and look at the redistribution that always happens every year based on performance, and then the distribution of new money as proposed by the governor. So just as a reminder, in November of 2015, we here at the Commission, Stephen and I and others, made a recommendation to our Commission and to the Governor for funding for our formula units and Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology. That funding recommendation was $40.9 million to fund the outcomes formula and to fund the TCATs, broken down to $37.5 million for the formula units and $3.4 million for the Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology. That was that's equivalent to about a 4.7% increase over 15-16, and it was coupled with a 0 to 3% tuition rec. What is included in the governor's budget for 16-17, as Stephen said, $46 million for the outcomes formula. So we asked for 37.5, currently recommending 46. What that means for our institutions, these are the 3 top performing institutions in the 16-17 model based on this new money suggestion. So Dyersburg State, Northeast State, and University of Tennessee at Chattanooga. All 3 will experience an 8.6% increase, and then these are the different funding levels for those institutions. And again, all of this is included in the Excel document labeled THEC Rec Governor's Recommendation. You'll also see $4 million for the Tennessee Colleges of Applied Technology. So thinking of 16-17 formula analysis, what does that mean? Stephen rightfully pointed out, and the formula model now is all based on share of total, and that's the most important thing. But we also know the share of total historically for our institutions. So basically looking at, of all available funding, how much funding went to each institution over the life of the outcomes-based funding formula. And this shouldn't be surprising. The ones that have seen growth in their funding levels based on performance have garnered larger proportions of the share of the total over the years. Focusing on Austin P, in 11-12, Austin P received 3.84% of the total appropriations. In 16-17, they'll receive 4.65% of the total appropriations. What's important about share of total, the level of funding is unimportant. Whatever amount of funding they give us, if it's reduced funding, if it's flat funding, or if it's new money, as the governor is suggesting, $46 million, you get the same share of whatever that total is based on what your performance here. So if you get either 4.65% of 0 or 10.42% of no new money at MTSU. So we received a question about the final rec sheet that says the final column is percent funded. Does that mean the state is only funding 66.7% of the formula? Yes, that's exactly what that means. And so the formula spits out a number that is closer to $1.3 billion, and the current appropriation level is, again, $860 million. And how that has changed since the new model was adopted? Well, firstly, when the new model was adopted, we had a hold harmless policy, which many of you are probably aware of. And so each of our institutions received different levels of percent funded. And one of the things that happened in the first 3 years of the outcomes formula, the 10-15 model, is we got rid of that hold harmless and brought everyone back to the same percent funded. The percent funded levels have fluctuated over the years. Again, it depends on whether or not we receive funding in a year. Last year, our percent funded was around, I believe, 63% in 15-16. In 14-15, we had a flat budget cycle, so we were around 60%. And in 13-14, we were around 65 because we received $35.5 million new dollars that year. So it fluctuates from year to year, but it has been historically below 70% for at least the lifetime of the outcomes-based funding formula, as we've brought everybody back to the same percent funded by getting rid of the hold harmless. But again, the way that we present the formula to the governor is we do ask that any increase in the percent funded does increase or should increase affordability for students, because it should be tied to lower tuition increases. Dr. White asked if THEC tracks funding appropriated by the state for raises. This is a great question. Each year we do the work program, which is provided by the Finance and Administration Office here in the state government, does point out salary dollars and benefits dollars. But all of that money, since everything is redistributed every year and built from the ground up, it's all basically the same color the next year. So salary dollars are not able to be backed out because everything just basically becomes appropriation money the following year. So it's impossible for us to track that money from year to year in order to back it out. So when you see a 15-16 number that says a recurring number, that recurring number includes any recurring money. So it would include salary, benefits, as well as outcomes productivity. Technically speaking, all recurring dollars are back up for grabs every year. Now, lastly, on the share of total, I would point out the community colleges. There was some discussion early on in the formula process that a performance model was not a model that community colleges could win at. And what we've seen over the last 6 years is that's not true. The share of total for our community colleges has stayed relatively stable. That money has not moved away from the community college sector towards the universities. And in fact, in 16-17, 2 of our top performing institutions were community colleges. Looking specifically here at the community colleges share of total, again, this is just provided for those institutions so that you don't just see an aggregated number. You can actually see how your institution performed. Chattanooga, again, from 2.94 of share of total in 11-12 up to 3.37. And then an institution like Walters from 2.32 to 2.52. This slide should be very familiar to many of you. This is the cumulative change in appropriations at universities due to the funding formula. The last year, so everyone always asks me, are these actual values? Starting from 10-11 up through 15-16, those are all actual appropriations that shows actual funding that was appropriated. 16-17, obviously, at this point is an estimate. That number is based on $46 million new dollars for the universities and community colleges in the governor's budget. So what we've seen overall, that thick black line in the middle there is showing the overall appropriation level for all of our formula units. And what we've seen in the 6 years of the model is about a 13% increase from when we started to where we are now with the $46 million recommendation. You can see several of our institutions are performing very well. Austin P. UT Chattanooga has definitely performed very well in the last 2 years, specifically, again, an 8.6% increase this year. Knoxville is doing well. Most of our institutions, however, what we see is on a given year, every university is moving about plus or minus 4% above or below whatever the total appropriation line is doing. So if the total appropriation is up 5%, we'll see institutions either up 1% or up as much as 9%. Same information here for the community colleges. And again, more lines with more institutions. So that thick black line is the same information that was provided for universities. That's the total cumulative movement of state appropriations. And we see the same things with our community colleges, where it's about a plus or minus 4% for our institutions, depending on how that overall line is moving. So one of the institutions I pointed out this year that did very well was Dyersburg State, again up 8.6%. You can see in 16-17 they've gone from being right at the average. In 14-15 they were below the total appropriation level. In 15-16 they were right at the total appropriation level average increase, and now they are above it. So that's some pretty good work at Dyersburg State. Okay, this concludes the webinar, unless there are any further questions. And again, if we didn't answer your question to your satisfaction, or we missed something, please feel free to either email me or Stephen. We would love to talk to you about this. We also, we've talked to Dr. Deaton about making our way out to institutions and to make this presentation in person, the demonstration part. So if you would like for us to come to your campus and speak to your staff about the funding formula, we would love to. We love going out to campuses across Tennessee and talking about it. And if you have any further questions, please let us know. And with that, we are done for the day. Thank you so much, and enjoy the rest of your week and weekend.